Welcome to 'Cause We're Nerds, the podcast that covers trends and new releases in comics, movies, video games, board games, and much more. I'm your host, Zach, and with me is my co-host and cousin, Caleb.
Hey everyone.
Thanks for joining us in our current series, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, where we will be discussing each MCU movie in order, all leading up to Marvel's Avengers Infinity War releasing in May. Arriving after the critical disappointment of Iron Man 2, how does Thor compare? Does this fourth movie in Phase 1 mesh magic with science in a way that doesn't alienate audiences? And was Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston the right casting choices? Find out the answers to these questions and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Thor. Caleb, Vanity Fair recently released a holiday issue in which they interviewed Kevin Feige, who confessed that he experiences pangs of anxiety multiple times on every MCU film, and would often question, is this the movie that's going to mess up everything? How likely do you think Feige had to pop Tums when thinking about releasing a movie that introduces a Norse god as a superhero to the general public?
Wow, what a question. That's a good one. I think that in recent memory, whenever we think of big risks that Marvel takes, it's Guardians, right? Guardians of the Galaxy. But really, this was the first big risk, aside from Iron Man, that they took. They came in, they did Iron Man, and Iron Man was a success. So they knew at that point, we can do this. And they already had the Incredible Hulk in the docket as well, so it was too late to change that. Iron Man 2 was pretty much a sure win as well because of the first movie. So this is the first one that came down that was like, not only is it a new character, it's a new character in a fantasy land. So how is this going to work? How are you going to mesh magic with this technological universe that they had already built? And was it going to work? So yeah, I think he was probably very nervous with this, even with someone as good as Kenneth Branagh at the helm.
And this is an interesting choice. This is Marvel's fourth movie in Phase 1, and as we talked about in our last podcast, after Iron Man 1 was released and its commercial success, is that Kevin Feige and Marvel announced that they were going to go ahead and try to launch the Avengers movie. So they lined up several other movies, Iron Man number 2, Thor, and Captain America. Now we'll talk about Captain America in our next installment, but why Thor?
Well, Kevin Feige is always really good about thinking of the universe as a whole. We had Iron Man, we had the Incredible Hulk, both steeped in science. He wanted to take something and expand the universe with it, right? So, if you're building towards the Avengers, you pick the Avenger that is most different. And that's really Thor. Thor comes from Norse mythology. He's not a character that most people know about in their everyday lives like they know about the Greek, mythology or those types of things. And so it's something that's different. It's something that expands the universe. And it also had some roots going back several years that also made it the reason why it was the one that was picked.
Yeah, I would agree. When I was watching this movie with my wife, I was like, oh yeah, it's Norse mythology. And I actually went on to explain it to her as she was familiar with, the Greek mythology, some Roman mythology, but not necessarily Norse mythology. I also think Feige had the idea of bringing the original Avengers together, which included Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, the Hulk, and also interestingly enough, Ant-Man and the Wasp, which once we get to the podcast covering Ant-Man, we'll talk about how that was originally in the docket to be released, but had some creative snafus.
You're right. So Ant-Man was a movie that they had scheduled to come out, and it was delayed. And, speaking of delays, this movie was delayed a very long time. So originally, Sam Raimi, the director that directed those first 3 Spider-Man movies, was going...
Emo Spider-Man.
was going to make this movie. Back in 1991, he was signed on to direct it.
Really?
Yeah, so he was coming in and he was going to make it, and things kind of fell apart as time went on. And then after the success of X-Men in 2000, this was a project that was actually going to be made for TV. Tyler Mane, the guy that played Sabretooth in that first X-Men movie, was actually approached to play Thor. How do you feel about that?
That would have definitely been an interesting TV show. I think at the time, they couldn't necessarily do a lot of the CGI aspects that would be needed in a show such as this. And so I can definitely see how this is a character that Marvel had wanted to release in a movie, had wanted to use in a movie, TV show, or some type of setting, and was never able to until Feige cast the vision of having an Avengers movie, and thus you get Thor.
That's right. So eventually, after that idea for the TV movie also kind of fell apart, the rights bounced around a few different places. We talked about a few weeks ago that Marvel, back in the 90s, was auctioning off their rights for different companies. And so these rights would go to one company, but then that company might sell them to another company, and they would kind of bounce around before they found their home. So in 2006, Paramount got the rights to the Thor movie. And Marvel Studios announced jointly with them that this was going to be an official film. Matthew Vaughn signed on to direct the film in 2007. Now, I'm not sure if you realize this, but Matthew Vaughn is the guy that directed X-Men First Class. He's directed Kingsman. He's directed a lot of really good comic book-based movies.
Mm-hmm. That's correct, yeah.
So he actually rewrote the script to bring the budget down to about $150 million, because when he came in, the script was going to be about a $300 million budget film. And he was intended to start filming in 2008. And after the success of Iron Man, they actually set the release date, as we mentioned, as June 4th, 2010. And it was also, he was supposed to be introduced in Iron Man 2 as a character.
However, this movie didn't release until a year later in 2011, so it was hung up for about a year.
Yeah, there were some things that happened. Vaughn ended up being released from his holding deal in May of 2008, and so he disconnected from the project. They actually approached Guillermo del Toro to direct this as well, which is a very interesting choice. And he passed this up to direct The Hobbit, which is a little unfortunate because, as we know, he ended up not directing The Hobbit either. Kenneth Branagh was brought in late 2008, and he's actually the director that ended up seeing this through to the very end. Because there were some delays, Marvel moved the release date actually a few more times until finally settling on May 6th, 2011.
And so going into this movie, how familiar were you with Thor the first time you saw it, or even now?
So when I first saw this, I was actually pretty familiar with Thor. I had been reading comics for several years at this point, and Thor has been a staple of Marvel Comics for a very long time. Any of the company crossovers he's going to be in, it's kind of hard to escape who Thor is. And even the year that this came out, they had the event called Fear Itself in the comics, which was very heavily leaned towards Thor and Odin and that whole mythology. So I was fairly familiar with the character. What was your exposure to him?
Yeah, I read some comics in the 90s and 2000s that had Thor in it. Definitely some Avengers comics, some crossover comics. However, I really became familiar with him when I started collecting Volume 3 when he was released. And so Volume 3, if you're not familiar with it in the comics, was kind of a relaunching and rebranding of Thor. So in the comics, a lot of times to reinvigorate more interest into a superhero, they try to relaunch their comics. And so they did so with Thor in 2007, and they had Michael Straczynski, who was writing Thor. And how they kind of changed him up was that they made him a more realistic Thor. And so he had kind of this muted look with chainmail and a black suit with a red cape versus kind of this bright blue and yellow and shiny Asgardian. He was more kind of down to earth and gritty, which is interesting because Straczynski actually gets a story credit in the film for that comic run.
And that's really the trend that comics were going at the time, and really everything, especially following the success of The Dark Knight that a year later in 2008. Everything was going towards, real, darker, grittier, and so I'm not surprised at all that the comics went that direction.
So before we jump into the movie, Marvel had to make two casting choices, that being Chris Hemsworth as Thor and Tom Hiddleston as Loki. What did you think of Chris?
So Chris actually was not the first choice for this role. I found this really interesting. Daniel Craig was offered the role before him, and he turned it down because of his commitment to the Bond franchise. And Chris actually auditioned for this role very early on in the process, and Marvel passed on him.
Really?
They did. He also has a brother named Liam who auditioned for the role, who got much farther in the casting process than Chris did originally. And because his brother got farther, that kind of sibling rivalry came in, and Chris said, you know what, I'm going to do this. And so at the time, Chris Hemsworth was filming Cabin in the Woods with director Joss Whedon, who actually ended up going on to direct The Avengers, which is kind of a funny coincidence.
Yeah.
And Joss encouraged Chris to go back and audition again. He said, you are right for this role. You need to be in it. So he did another tape, and he sent it in, and he was chosen for Thor. Now, Chris Hemsworth was not a very big name at that point. Had you heard of him?
I hadn't really necessarily heard of Chris at this point. However, after watching Thor, I agree with Joss Whedon. He was a great Thor and a great casting choice by Marvel.
Yeah, so at the time that he was hired, he was pretty much known only as an Australian actor. He had been on a fairly popular TV show called Home and Away for 3 or 4 years at that point. And he was trying to come to the US and do something different. So this was really the big break he needed.
So while a British actor didn't work in the case of Thor, a British actor did work to play Thor's brother in the movie Loki. So for Loki, they cast Tom Hiddleston. And Tom Hiddleston actually, interestingly enough, auditioned for Thor. And so he auditioned for Thor, didn't hear back for a couple months, and as he states, was later called, and they just flat out told him, they said, hey, you didn't make the cut for Thor, but would you like to be Loki? He says he hung up the phone and just started screaming out of joy, because up to this point, Hiddleston hadn't done much. He had actually done some TV series and spots here and there, but no true movie was on the map for him.
That's right. He did have a show that he did in collaboration with HBO and BBC. That was probably his biggest project to date, but he was not known to the general populace.
And so you have these two actors, not necessarily known to the general public, coming on to a movie about a god and superhero who is also not generally known to the public.
So aside from Chris and Tom, there was a couple other characters in this movie. We have Natalie Portman playing Jane Foster. She signed on in July of 2009, and following her, most of the cast had signed on by November of 2009, including the main characters of Odin, who is played by
Anthony Hopkins.
And then they had a few other casting additions that they added after the new year. But for the most part, the whole cast was lined up and ready to go, and filming started on January 10th of 2010.
So with our casting all in line, Caleb, if I told you that Marvel was releasing a movie about an alien race of green rocks that lands on the Earth, is spotted by an old or middle-aged man with a cane who trips while running away, wanders into a cave, tries to move a boulder weighing a couple tons only using his arms, obviously fails, finds a secret passage, discovers a random stick on a random rock, has the bright idea of using this flimsy stick to move the 2-ton boulder, fails again, gets angry, whacks the stick against the rock, turning him to the god of thunder, Thor. Would you have watched that movie?
That sounds terrible. Is that the original origin?
That is the original origin of Thor. And lucky for us, Marvel made a wise choice and decided not to go that route. Instead, Caleb, why don't you give us the synopsis of the movie we got?
After nearly igniting war against the frost giants, the mighty warrior Thor is cast out from Asgard by his father Odin and sent down to Earth. With no way home and his magical hammer Mjolnir lost, Thor struggles to reclaim his powers. Slowly gaining the help of scientist Jane Foster and her team, Thor must learn the true virtue of being a hero and return home to save Asgard from destruction.
The movie opens and we find ourselves on Earth, particularly in New Mexico. We have 3 characters, Jane Foster, Darcy, and Dr. Selvig. Caleb, I only have one question for you. Who the heck are these people, and how are they even related?
Yeah, these are characters that, for the most part, were created for this film. I believe. I know Jane Foster is definitely from the comics, but I don't know if Eric Selvig and definitely Darcy is not. And at this point, they're just these three random people that seem like storm chasers that are coming in.
Yeah, Darcy is more of the comic relief that doesn't work at all. But, that's just my opinion.
I know a lot of people that feel that way, but I don't actually mind Darcy for the most part. There are a few things she does that grates on my nerves, but I think she's actually just a serviceable character. Now, one thing about this scene that is interesting is that the entire thing is filmed off kilter. They've taken the camera and sort of tilted it at like a 20 or 30 degree angle for this entire scene. And I think what they're trying to do is give us a sense that we don't know what's going on. Anytime a camera is flat looking at something, it gives the impression that everything's normal, that the audience knows what's going on, that there's nothing strange. And by turning it off kilter, it starts this movie off with a sense of mystery.
Now, right after this scene, we jump into Asgard and the Bifrost and the history of Odin's war with the frost giants. To me, this was a very Lord of the Rings-esque backstory that they launched right into, and I loved it. What did you think?
This is something that I remembered was in the movie, but I didn't realize how good it was. I kind of want a spin-off movie just talking about this war.
It looks great, and while watching it, I had to compare it to the opening of Lord of the Rings and the war that happened in Middle-earth. There were, I felt like, a lot of parallels, especially how they shot the scene. However, when watching it, it brings up an important question. How does this storyline necessarily fit into Thor 3, Thor Ragnarok?
How so?
Odin is conquering the frost giants, right? However, where is Hela? You don't see his daughter here at all. Okay, you could have had her locked up at this point, but Thor Ragnarok showed us that by the time he locked her away, Odin was done with his conquest.
Well, this opening tells us that this isn't really conquest. He's defending the earth. So I think maybe the conquest had ended at this point, and Asgard has gone to the state that we see in this film. And then a war breaks out between Asgard and the Frost Giants, which is something that's very big in the comic lore. And they go to Earth to stop the Frost Giants from taking over Earth. So it's more of defending and less conquering.
So watching these movies, going back and watching Thor, when I saw the machine that the Frost Giants had, I went, oh yeah, that's the Tesseract. However, we come to later find out that's simply the casket of ancient winners, which, interestingly enough, showed up in Thor 344.
Yeah, my wife said the very same thing. As we do with all of these, we're watching them together. And she saw it and said, is that the Tesseract? And I looked at her and said, no, that's the casket of ancient winters. But you're right, they do use the exact same effect for the center of those things. And I think this is an example of early in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they didn't really have a good sense that they needed to separate these two visually. And so they kind of become this thing that people can get confused about and might cause issues for the less intense viewer.
They're both blue, they both glow, they both look shiny.
They're both cubes.
They're both cubes. And it was after this backstory that we dive into the kingdom of Asgard itself, and we see Thor almost getting crowned king. When you saw Loki for the first time, Thor for the first time, Odin for the first time, and everybody else there, what did you think of their wardrobes?
The wardrobes in this film, specifically on Asgard, are some of the most beautiful pieces of clothing and armor that I have ever seen. In fact, even the look of Asgard in general, I was aware of Thor and what Asgard was, but I didn't have an idea in my head of what the aesthetic was for Asgard. This film sets that for, I think, everyone who sees this film. Everything is gold. It's beautiful. The armor is majestic, flowing edges. I just love the look of this film. And it's something that I think really elevates this film from being just another comic book movie to being something a little bit more grand. This entire opening is very grand. They're in, this enormous throne room. And so I really, really, really love this stuff. I mean, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I loved Thor's helmet, how shiny it was. I loved a lot of the aesthetics, specifically Asgard itself. If you look at the Rainbow Bridge, even though it gets better with each movie, in this first movie, it's still a sight to behold. And when we consider that this movie is the fourth movie in the MCU, this is the first movie that goes outside of the Earth. So we had Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, and Iron Man 2, which all similarly take place on Earth. However, this one goes outside of that and almost has this sci-fi feeling as it's a different place altogether that we have never been to.
I agree. I think it goes a long way to expanding that universe, like I mentioned earlier. And I think that it sets the tone for what the future of the Thor movies are going to be, but it also doesn't, because they're able to take this and still have this beautiful architecture, but show us some other elements that are not quite so polished.
I agree. And in this beautiful setting, we soon learn that frost giants have broken into the vault, where we get Odin, Loki, and Thor going to the vault to vanquish the villains. And it's here we see a couple Easter eggs.
Yeah, so before Thor is actually crowned, Odin stops everything. I guess he's got like the sixth sense that he has in his head, and he activates the Destroyer. And this is the first time we see the Destroyer, and he comes in, and his face opens up, and he just obliterates the Frost Giants. And so as the Frost Giants are walking in, and as the Destroyer is obliterating them, we see those artifacts that you're talking about. One of them is something that looks mysteriously like the Eye of Agamotto. We find out it's not through interviews with Kevin Feige. And in a very fleeting scene, we do see the Infinity Gauntlet.
And at the time, I know there was a ton of speculation, a ton of hype, and somewhat controversy over that scene.
Fans knew that this was going to be in the film because the year prior, in 2010 at Comic-Con, Marvel brought a whole bunch of stuff from the set of Thor to the floor so that people could see it. They brought the helmets, they brought Odin's throne, they brought a statue version of the Destroyer, but they also brought the Infinity Gauntlet. And when this was revealed, people went crazy. Obviously, the Infinity Gauntlet is a very powerful item in the Marvel Universe, and it's a staple of Thanos, a character. And at this time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there was no hints that Thanos would ever be a possibility. And even when this was revealed, people didn't instantly say, oh, Thanos is coming. They said, oh, cool, what an awesome Easter egg. Look how cool that looks.
But little did they know, May of 2018, baby.
That's right.
Now, in this scene, we get a glimpse of the Destroyer, as you mentioned. And this is our first glimpse of him that kind of sets him up to later be introduced to fight Thor. What did you think of his introduction, his design, and his power?
When I first saw this, I thought this entire part was amazing. He's behind this gate, I guess you could call it, encased in light. And when Odin activates him, the gate just kind of disappears. It like absorbs into itself, and he walks through, and he looks awesome. His face opens up. You see that there's this glow in his chest, and one shot completely obliterates the Frost Giants. I was just in awe of his power. What were your thoughts?
Aesthetically, he looks amazing. For a movie shot in 2011, I thought they did a great job on the CGI of the Destroyer, and I thought it set it up really well in the fact that he is a powerful robot, if you will, and he can destroy. What didn't work for me at this scene is the fact that Thor, 1 minute prior, was about to become crowned king, which means Odin was set to crown him king. He was ready to be established as the king, and yet right after this scene, after Thor blows up, Odin basically tells Thor, but you are not king and you won't be king for a while.
Well, I think that works for me because it's kind of like when you know someone's about to get a promotion, right? And they start to really come into their own, but they start overstepping their bounds a little bit because even though they're about to be promoted and they're about to be your boss, they aren't yet. You know, it's that kind of fine line when you're growing up where you're learning what's appropriate and what's not, when to do things, you know, when you're a teenager. And I think that Odin is completely fine in his defense and saying that he's not king. If Thor were king, even if Odin didn't agree, I think he would have gone with it because he has no choice at that point.
Caleb, have you ever run a kingdom before?
Yes, actually, many.
The kingdom of your home?
The kingdom of my home.
And that's why I don't think it worked, at least for me, right? In your analogy you gave, the boss would have had to sign papers. Maybe he's getting ready to retire. They already have the party planned. He's ready to get home to his wife, play some golf, watch some TV, relax, have somebody else take his job. It wouldn't really realistically be okay to simply redo everything. And thus, that's what Odin did. He would have had to sign papers, get everything in order, and in just one simple action, he decided, Thor, nope, you're not ready. I'm going to be king for another X amount of years.
Well, I don't think it's at this point that that's decided. I think that, you know, in a lot of ancient dynasties and kingdoms, kings were not kings until they went through some anointment process or some ceremony, and that's what the ceremony was. So it was stopped because of an invasion. Thor was proposing something that to his father was preposterous and could bring down the entire kingdom and start a war. So he reacts negatively to it. And he's telling him, you don't get to make this decision yet because you're not king. He's not saying that he doesn't get to be king. But because this has to be at a ceremony, everybody has to convene again. Because I'm sure that once they realized what was going on, they sent all the civilians back home. It's going to be like lockdown mode, right? So everybody has to go back to your house. And so they have to reconvene to start the ceremony over again. And if we follow the trace of the next few scenes, there's not enough time for that before Thor goes off the deep end and does something that does make Odin say, you're not ready.
I guess I'll give you this one, Caleb. And as you mentioned, Thor reacts in a very childish way, which is basically his story arc throughout this entire movie. Acting like a child, reacting like a child, following his emotions, and growing up into a more kingly and decisive person. And so right after this incident, we find Thor with the Warriors 3, Sif, and Loki all looking to go to the Bifrost and confront the giants.
So at this point, we're only 20 minutes into the movie, but they have told us a ton of information. They've introduced us to a completely new world, Asgard. They've told us that there's this sort of kingly reign going on with Odin and Loki and Thor. They've set up that Thor is supposed to be king, that he's not king. They've set up that Odin has this monstrosity that is called the Destroyer that can just destroy things, for lack of a better word.
Oh, yeah.
They've established that he's got a treasure vault that has magical, powerful items in it. They've established that the Casket of Ancient Winters is very important. They've established the Frost Giants. They've established so much in this 20 minutes that I think for people seeing this for the first time, they're reeling a little bit. But they do it in such a masterful way that it doesn't feel like you're being overloaded with information, even though you sort of are.
And I think the action helps out a lot in this, is that it continues to move the plot and the movie forward. During this scene, they go to the Bifrost, they confront the head frost giant,
Laufey,
and it's here we get a glimpse of Thor's arrogance. How arrogant is Thor at this moment?
That's kind of a hard question to answer because we don't have a measurement for arrogance, but man, if we did, Thor would probably be that number one number on that scale. I mean, His arrogance and frustration is the only reason that they go here to begin with. And once he gets here, they almost don't fight. Not him, but Loki and the Warriors 3 and Sif realize we're in over our heads. Because they're talking to the king of the frost giants, they start to be surrounded by them. And so Loki is trying to play diplomat, right? And he does that a lot in this movie. He's very duplicitous. And he says, Thor, let's get out of here. And surprisingly, Thor says, okay. But as soon as someone confronts him, as soon as someone insults him, it's all over. And that's what happens. And he turns around and he starts just destroying everything. And you see that he wants war. He wants to go there and fight. As soon as it starts, he's excited. He's taunting them. He says, give me a challenge. He wants to fight.
And they give him a challenge. And here's where I think the movie establishes him as an extremely powerful superhero. In Iron Man 2, and The Incredible Hulk, all the MC movies we've seen up to this point, they fought some villains, but the biggest fight scene would be in Iron Man 2, where Iron Man, as well as Rhodey, fought a bunch of other drones together. Here, we see Thor besting these giants, frost giants to be exact, and he is just destroying them. The Warriors 3 and Loki are obviously helping, but Thor is doing the main damage to the attacking army. And it's here, I believe, that the MCU establishes up to this point that Thor could possibly be and is the strongest Avenger to date. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is completely irrefutable. There is no question in my mind that at this point, Thor is definitely the strongest. For every one frost giant that the others take out, he's taken out at least 10. And he's swinging his hammer around, and he's doing so many creative things that we hadn't seen in a Marvel movie at this point, but also in any movie at this point. He's swinging the hammer around, and he uses it at one point to basically pull up the ground and take out the frost giants with the ice on the ground, which I thought was really cool. I mean, what are your thoughts on that scene?
Yeah, I thought the scene was very epic, and it's during this fight scene that we see Thor throw his hammer and then call it back to him. And this is paying homage to Journey into Mystery number 125, which was Thor's first appearance. And when Thor first appeared, as I kind of mentioned in this synopsis, he was a normal guy, Donald Blake, who found a random stick and can hit it on the ground, and he becomes Thor. And in this comic, Thor is talking, or Donald Blake is talking about how he is Thor himself, and just recalls out of Norse mythology that the god of thunder, Thor, can throw his hammer and it comes back to him. And it does that in the comics, kind of swoops around. And you see that in this movie. And I thought that was great.
This is something that's become so iconic that when I saw it in this film for this watching, I kind of took it for granted. And then I stopped for a second and thought about it. Aside from a boomerang or something, I couldn't think of any other characters that have something that acts like this. So I think this would have been the first time audiences have seen a magical object that can do something like this. And it's really interesting and really cool.
Yeah, the hammer looked great. And actually, a lot of the scenes surrounding this fight scene looked fantastic, even though a lot of it was CGI. The Bifrost looked fairly good. The Frost Giants, I thought, looked fairly good. But in places, it does seem somewhat choppy. For example, as they start running away, we get that dog, cat, creature thingy. And for me, you could definitely tell that that was full on CGI.
Yeah, there's a couple scenes in this film that you do see the CGI. And I think it's just a fact of its age. I don't remember seeing that when I first watched it. I think the most obvious one in this scene is when they're being chased, Hogan is running away. And I never thought that scene looked quite right, but it looks like he probably just stood in place and was acting like he was running, and then he jumps, and it's clearly him standing in front of a green screen.
Now, they didn't green screen the entire set. Obviously, they had to green screen a lot of the Bifrost, but Asgard or New Mexico itself, were those green screens or were those sets? I mean, would have to be fairly expensive.
So it really depends on which specific part you're talking about. But as Marvel normally does, they try to make as many sets as possible. I know that specifically for this chase scene where they're running away from that dog creature, they had a very complicated set up where the ground would move and they would have to jump from platform to platform. Normally what they do is they build these sets and then they have a green screen in the background to extend it so that it looks, 10 times bigger than it is. And it works really well. They do that in Asgard a lot, especially for any of the scenes that are near a balcony. And we'll get to the town in just a couple scenes. But I think that all of the practical stuff in this film looks really good.
And it's at this point that Odin swoops down and saves the Warriors 3, Sif, Loki, and Thor himself, kind of humiliating Thor, who wanted a battle, wanted this fight. And after being transported back to Asgard, we get a sudden change as Odin decides to banish Thor and send him away. However, he sends him away with his hammer, a way for Thor to actually reclaim it and come back. So he doesn't necessarily banish him for eternity. He banishes him with a plan.
When I saw this for the first time, I thought that this scene felt very, very rushed. And watching it since then, I don't feel the same way, but I think it doesn't have enough time to breathe as it should. And I think part of that is because there's so much in this film that they're trying to fit in. It's just hard, especially with the running time. This is not a super long movie. It's pretty short. But the scene itself is beautiful. There's, if you watch the behind the scenes or read any interviews, you'll find out that they did this scene several times, and they did it where Odin was angry, and he is a little bit angry in this film, but on the very last take, Kenneth Branagh said, "Look, give me a little bit of sadness, because you're a father, you're punishing your child, and like a lot of fathers, he doesn't want to do this, but he knows that he has to do this to teach his son a lesson." And so he put in some sadness, and that's the take that ends up in this film. And I think it's that sadness that really makes this scene work, and it humanizes Odin, and it makes us feel for him, but also feel how much Thor has just screwed up.
Yeah, it's a quick scene, but it does work really well. I thought it interesting that it was at this part that Odin speaks to the hammer, saying, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor," and then chucks it after Thor, which, as I already mentioned, is a fit right into the comics, as when Donald Blake whacks that stick against the rock, when he has the hammer, that's what it says. It also sets up a rather interesting issue. Whoever holds the hammer has the power of Thor, right? And in the comics, Donald Blake is only Thor when he holds the hammer. When he has the hammer, he has all the powers. Now, he still has the powers when he throws the hammer and it comes back to him. He doesn't have to physically be holding the hammer, but he has to actually have the hammer with him, which, again, kind of becomes an issue when considering Thor Ragnarok.
Well, I view this as sort of like an enchantment, right? It's a one-off. Whoever is able to lift it the first time regains those powers. And then it doesn't work anymore, right? It's a nod to the comics, and it's a way to get this plot going, but I don't think that it's something that's always there. I mean, I could be wrong about that. What are your thoughts?
So, I'm just wondering, is the Vision Thor number 2? Maybe Frog Thor?
Oh, no. He's Robot Thor.
Oh, yes.
And before we get too far, I do want to mention at this point, Odin throws that hammer through the Bifrost by itself. And this is where we get something that I think is really cool. If I watch this on a Blu-ray, and when you put the Blu-ray in, of course they have the menu where you select if you want to watch the movie or special features. But the menu for this movie, the thing playing in the background, is the hammer traveling through space on its way to Earth. You see Odin, the very first time it plays, he says, "Whosoever holds his hammer, if he be worthy, should possess the power of Thor." He throws it, and then it just goes through space, and you get all these beautiful shots of space, similar to the ones you get when you see Thor going through the Bifrost. And I think that that's just a really, really cool idea for a menu. And in my opinion, the best menu Marvel has done.
So we find ourselves back on Earth, which we haven't visited since the opening credits scene, and Thor gets run over, which is a ongoing shtick in this movie. And he wakes up and he's in the hospital. And I love this hospital scene. It's a quick scene. It's simple. It's easy. But I think it establishes the fact that Thor has lost his powers. Yes, he's a little strong as he tosses the orderlies and the doctors around, but he is not invincible anymore.
You're exactly right. And something that's really funny in this scene, when he realizes what's going on, he starts fighting everyone. There's one nurse that's just kind of standing there. He just backs up. Everyone else is flying towards Thor, trying to lock him down. And there's just this one guy who's like, nope, I'm out of here.
His name is Donald Blake. While we never do get a cameo from Donald Blake, we do get a cameo from our favorite Stan Lee.
So we see that the hammer has fallen into a crater, and it's sort of like the sword and the stone, as my wife pointed out. Everybody's trying to lift it, and they can't. And so they've taken a chain, and they've attached it to the little pedestal that it's kind of sitting on, and they've attached the other end to a truck, and they're pulling it, and the bed just flies right off. And it's a really funny scene. And then the icing on the cake is we find out Stan Lee's the one driving the truck, trying to lift the hammer up. And he looks back and he's like, did it work?
I love that scene. And I would agree with your wife here. I felt like this was a very Sword in the Stone-esque scene, but it was like Sword in the Stone hillbilly version, right? Because everybody had their beer, they were cooking, they had their trucks out. And not only do we get a cameo from Stan Lee, but we also get a cameo from Michael Straczynski, who I mentioned previously wrote the comic run of the relaunch of Thor in Volume 3, which this movie heavily leans on when taking inspiration for the design and Thor himself.
That's right. So following on from this scene, we see that Thor is taken home by Jane Foster. And
this starts the scenes that we get all throughout Marvel of superheroes with their shirts off, right? And so we see Chris Hemsworth, his shirt is off. Man, he is looking pristine and clean.
Dude is ripped. He looks great.
Yeah, I think this was actually my wife's favorite scene in the entire movie.
I know when I saw this, it was the favorite scene of all my friends' moms.
Actually, let's not kid ourselves. This was our favorite scene as well.
Well, I mean, how can it not be? I mean, dude worked for months. I don't know if you've seen a picture of him before he signed on to this movie when he was on Home and Away, but he looks more like a surfer. He was very, very skinny, very thin. And here he is like ripped with the best of them.
I'm pretty sure this is actually in all of the leading role or leading actors' contract. Is they have, they sign the contract. It requires them to work 8 hours a day, eat only grilled chicken and rice, and dehydrate themselves. And so after they sign it, they're like, okay, we want an add-on that in every scene or in one scene in the movie, our shirt is off, right? So you get that with Thor. You get that with the other Chris Evans. You get that, well, you don't get it with Ant-Man, but you get it with Star-Lord.
And we got it with Iron Man in the first one.
I'm telling you, man, it's in the contract.
Contracts rule everything.
We also get an interesting cameo here when Jane Foster gives Thor some clothes, and on the clothes, or scrubs, he has a name tag that says Donald Blake, which is an interesting Easter egg pointing to the comics.
And in this version, she says it's an ex-boyfriend that she's no longer seeing, and so it's kind of brushed aside as something we'll never see more of.
This starts establishing the rhythm that the movie falls into, where we go from Earth to Asgard, from Earth to Asgard, and it keeps jumping between these two places. So we jump back to Asgard, and Caleb, what did you think of Xena, Jackie Chan, and Robin Hood?
That's a great line in this movie, and I don't know who thought it up, but props to them. So we come to the Warriors 3, who are Fandral, who's the one that looks like Robin Hood. We've got Hogan, which is the Jackie Chan, and we've got Volstagg, who is the big guy with the red hair, and Sif, which is the woman. And they're sitting around, and they're just kind of talking. They're trying to figure out what happened and how Odin knew to come save them. Loki turned him in. What do you think about that?
You know, I don't know what to think about that.
I mean, on one hand, Loki's right, because they're going against the orders of the king. But on the other hand, it's kind of a jerk move to turn your friends in for something that they're doing. So I have mixed feelings about it. And I think this is our first hint that he's not on the same moral ground as everyone else.
And I would agree with you here, Caleb. I mean, it's hard watching this movie in hindsight of knowing everything that's happened in the MCU or even just in the movie itself. However, if you're familiar with Norse mythology just in general, Loki is a trickster by nature. That's kind of his power. That's who he is. We already got a glimpse of that during the Bifrost fight scene that shows how he can trigger multiple, I guess, hymns, for lack of a better word.
Projections.
Yes, thank you. He can trigger these projections, right? And so it gives you a glimpse of his trickery, and I think that starts to show in this scene as well.
And this is really, I think, the first scene that we see the Warriors 3 by themselves and kind of who they are. And I want to note that Volstagg, again, the big guy with the red beard, he's played by Ray Stevenson. And I believe this is the first actor that Marvel has cast that has played a superhero in a previous movie. He played the Punisher in the Punisher Warzone film that came out a few years before this.
Really? I didn't realize that. Did he just gain a bunch of weight?
I think they put him in a bodysuit, but he looks so completely different. It'd be very, very easy to miss that it was the same guy. I mean, in the Punisher, he's got black hair that's slicked back, and in this one, he's got these long, flowing locks of red hair and a giant beard, which covers half of his face.
And so when we consider the Warriors 3 and Sif, which all appear in the comics, what did you think about them in this movie? Did you think they were good supporting characters? Did you think it didn't work at all? Or were they just okay?
So I'm going to be honest. I said I knew about Thor. I didn't really know about the Warriors 3. I don't know much about who they are in the comics. I know that physically they fit the description from the comics. Volstagg's a big dude, Hogan's an Asian dude, and Fandrel's a dude that looks like Robin Hood. And I think they embody those traits really well. In terms of how it works in the movie, I think it's a lot of fun. I mean, they bring some variety to all the other characters who are just, godly characters or conflicted characters. These are like the group of friends that you want to have, that you want to hang out with, right? They're always going to be there for you. They're always looking out for you, and they seem like they've been lifelong friends.
We jump back to Earth, and in the diner is sitting Thor, Jane Foster, Darcy, and Dr. Solveig. And as those four are talking, Thor overhears somebody talking about a hammer, asks where it is, and he just books it out of there.
Yeah, he goes outside, and I want to take this moment to say props to the set team.
Props. LOL. Good joke there.
Thanks. This entire city, this town, is not a real town. They constructed everything solely for this movie. And I don't mean like there was some roads here and they built a couple of buildings. They went in, they did everything, all the infrastructure. They did roads, they did signposts, they did buildings, everything. And I don't know any other movie that has ever built something this big just for that single film.
So this is kind of like Hobbiton and Lord of the Rings. So Caleb, just as we could go to New Zealand and start exploring some Hobbit homes, could we travel to New Mexico and start exploring this small town?
Well, this wasn't actually built in New Mexico. I'm not exactly sure where it was built. It might have been just somewhere off in maybe Nevada or something. I'm not sure. But I don't think there's much left of it. We'll see later in the film, a lot of this town gets destroyed, and they actually blew things up.
So after Thor departs, the other Warriors 3, let's call them the Earth Warriors 3 because, well, it works.
They are pretty much the same thing, but smarter.
And so these physicists go back to their compound where they meet S.H.I.E.L.D., who's taking everything away, including Darcy's iPod.
Oh, the iPod. I was wondering, were iPods still a thing at this point?
I don't like Darcy in this movie, so I don't care.
Ouch. All right, well, moving on. I feel like this S.H.I.E.L.D. scene works well and is far better integrated than the S.H.I.E.L.D. scenes that were in Iron Man 2. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the story arc of S.H.I.E.L.D. works a lot better, as well as Agent Coulson. However, I do have a question. Do you think this kind of goes against what S.H.I.E.L.D. stands for? They're simply taking all the research, all the equipment from Jane Foster and Dr. Solveig. They're not taking anything from Darcy other than her iPod. And they're just writing them a check?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think if there's any other instances in the Marvel Universe where we see anything like this. I mean, if you compare it to Iron Man 2, they didn't take his stuff, but they did lock him in his house. And I don't watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., or haven't in a long time, so I'm not sure what they do on there. But I don't feel like it would be too much out of their purview.
And we'll see this later on, but I believe that S.H.I.E.L.D. actually becomes sort of an antagonist, specifically for Thor, but for the rest of these Warriors 3 on Earth and Thor himself. And I don't think it necessarily goes hand in hand with how they have been portrayed so far, or if it necessarily works. Agent Coulson is kind of a douchebag.
He's got an expanded role here, but I think this is a natural progression of what we've seen in the other films, because even though we've seen them in Iron Man, Iron Man 2, and they're mentioned in The Incredible Hulk, we don't really get a sense of what they do on a daily basis or what their power is. And I think for something that they feel is a worldwide threat, they would totally come in and take all of this stuff and write them a check. And I think that they need to know what this artifact is. They don't know. It could be an alien invasion, which ends up happening later in the Marvel universe. You know, this could be a warning sign. I think it's good that they're going and they're trying to figure out what it is. Maybe they should have built something that's stronger than just some plastic over metal, though.
All right, Caleb, you win round 2. You win round 2.
Oh, yeah.
He's drinking water, folks. He's dehydrated.
Man, you gotta stay hydrated when you're doing these things. Your mouth gets real dry.
I'm just waiting for you to do the transition. Anytime now. Anytime.
Oh, sorry, everyone. So moving on, we jump back to Asgard, where we see that Loki is investigating something that happened during the fight scene earlier. A frost giant grabbed his arm, and his arm turned blue. And he doesn't know what that's about because it didn't hurt him. But when the same thing happened to Volstagg, he definitely cried out in pain.
So Loki himself is wallowing in pity down in the throne room? No, the vault. And it's here that he visits the vault and grabs the second Tesseract.
The Casket of Ancient Winters.
And lo and behold, he doesn't die. He doesn't, well, get hurt, but instead turns blue.
Mr. Smurf.
And Odin, at this point, is also right by Loki. Loki questions his father, and this moment didn't really work for me, because it's this point that Odin starts to keel over, and my first thought was, is he having a heart attack?
Yeah, so there's something that Odin does in the Thor books that they haven't really mentioned yet in this film, which is the reason he's kneeling over. He has to go through something called the Odin sleep every so many years or however long. And basically, the reason is Odin is not just the king. Odin is the source of power, at least in the comic books, that sort of defends Asgard. In the comics, Asgard is constantly under attack by frost giants, and so they need this protection. And I'm not sure if that's something that they're playing into in the film's version, but he has to go through rest to kind of replenish his energy, right? And so we find out in a few scenes that he's put it off for a long time, probably waiting to crown Thor as king so that he can rule while Odin is sleeping. And he's put it off too long, and he falls down, and it could also potentially be the stress of Loki finding out that he is not Odin's son. He's a frost giant. And Loki is very, very perturbed by this. And I think that maybe that stress kind of sent Odin over the edge, and he has to get his sleep now.
And Caleb, as you mentioned, this is basically whenever Odin just wants to take a little nap. And it was actually created in the comics by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And the reason they created this Odin sleep was because Odin was so powerful that they needed to create this so that Thor could actually have some type of antagonist in the comics to fight him. And that when Thor went on adventures and mishaps happened, the reader wasn't thinking, well, why isn't Odin appearing and saving him like he does in the movie? Well, this is the reason. It's because Odin is asleep.
Yeah, and they do something similar in the X-Men movies. If you'll notice, nearly every X-Men movie takes Professor X out of the equation for at least the final fight or most of the fights, because he's just so powerful that he could end it instantly.
And we jump back to Earth after viewing the Odin sleep with Thor and Natalie Portman, who decide to hit the road. Well, before they decide to hit the road, we see Thor trying to buy a pet large enough that he can ride.
So this is one of the jokes that I felt was, I don't want to say amazing, but really well executed, and got laughs for several years. I don't know if it still does.
It still does.
He walks to the pet store and asks for a horse. Obviously, the dude's like, dude, what are you smoking? We don't have horses. And it's here that he ends up running back into Jane Foster.
And Jane decides to give him a lift to go to the S.H.I.E.L.D. compound. Obviously, only because Thor is willing to tell her whatever she wants to know, and possibly take his shirt off as well.
Right, and they don't know that it's been turned into a S.H.I.E.L.D. compound at this point. She just thinks she's taking him to a crater site, so she does get in a little over her head.
After this short scene, we again jump back to Asgard, jumping back and forth, and we see Loki having a moment with his mom during the Odin sleep, but we also see that Loki is now the ruler of Asgard.
So when I saw this, especially this time, my question was, did Loki usurp the throne? Because we jump from a scene where he's talking with his mother to a scene where he's proclaiming to the Warriors 3 that he is king. And there's no connective tissue between there. And so I'm wondering, is he really king?
At this point, I would say yes, with a question mark. Odin is asleep. Thor is banished, which means the only person that can be king is Loki. And it's at this point when the Warriors 3 come in, they bow to their king. And you get the feeling that Loki has done everything up to this point to become the king.
So the answer to the question is actually yes, he is rightfully king. And the reason I know that is there's a deleted scene that you can watch, which is actually an extension of the scene where he's speaking to his mother. And the guards come in and they say, you are now king, for exactly the reasons you said. So he is king, and the warriors reluctantly bow to him.
And so I actually love Loki's story arc. I love Tom Hiddleston's portrayal of Loki. And it's at this point in the movie, you start connecting the dots that, okay, he has done all of this to become the king. But what I really like about the arc of Loki is that that's still not it. In fact, in the next 30, 40 minutes, we'll actually get kind of a continuing arc for this character. And I thought Hiddleston did just a fabulous job on it.
And I actually had a question about this watching the film this time, because I'm not sure that this was his plan the whole time. We see through different scenes that he says we find out actually that he was the one who let the frost giants in to Asgard, and he did it for the sole purpose of ruining Thor's coronation, right? And the next time we see him talking to the frost giants is after he's been crowned king. So the way this plays out, I'm wondering if these are separate events, because he's king, but we see, especially from the Warriors 3, they don't want him to be king. They think he's a little bit too duplicitous, a little bit too not being able to be trusted. And so I think that maybe he sees this moment. He says, no, I can hatch a plan so that everybody in Asgard actually wants me to be king. And he does it in such a way, we'll talk about it as we get to it, that Odin would be proud of him. And I think that this is an extension of what happened in the vault when he found out that he's not Odin's son. Finding that out broke him. You can see it on his face and in the things that he's saying. And I think that he's wanting to do something to try to prove himself to his father. And so I'm not sure if all this is connected or not. It could be if you want to play it that way, but I think it's also vague enough that it doesn't have to be.
And that's a great point, Caleb. The way I took it is that this isn't ultimately his final motivation. His final motivation is a classic, he wants to prove himself to his dad. Because growing up, his dad has always gone with Thor over Loki. We return to Earth to find that Thor's hammer is now encased in a shield facility that they have almost sprung up overnight. And Thor and Portman herself find this out.
So we get a cool little moment here because they're watching the compound and Thor says, here, you're going to need this. And right after he says that, it starts thundering and raining. And that's a cool little nod because he's, the god of thunder. And so he goes to break into the facility. And I'm not sure if it's this scene or maybe a scene prior, but we get our first introduction to Agent Jasper Sitwell, who will kind of take a Coulson role in the next few films, where he pops up now and again, and he is basically, he's got commanding authority over this installation that they've popped up.
Not only do we get Agent Sitwell, but we get a huge reveal, Hawkeye. And upon seeing this, I had not remembered at all that Hawkeye was in this movie. And so when they started scattering people, once Thor starts breaking into the compound, we see Coulson command somebody over the radio, and this person goes to grab a gun, and then their hand moves up and they grab the bow. And I am like, oh my goodness, Hawkeye is in this movie.
This was the first introduction to Hawkeye, and I remember him being in here. It was a really big point, rumor before the film came out that he might be in it. What I didn't remember is how clearly we see him. I thought that his face was pretty much obstructed by his arm or the lighting, but it is definitely Jeremy Renner in the role of Hawkeye, which he will reprise many times in the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And he's on character as well. I think that, we've talked about how some of the characterizations change once we get to Avengers, but I don't feel that's true for him.
And Iron Man 2, take note, this is how you introduce a character. He didn't have a huge role. It was a very minor role, but we still got to see him. He was a nod to all the comic book fans out there, and he portrayed himself in such a way that when he pops up in Avengers, you can tie him back to Thor and go, oh yeah, I remember that guy. And he doesn't have any cheesy lines such as, "I'll keep my eye on you."
Let's not talk about that. But eventually Thor does get to the center, and he goes to lift the hammer, and he looks very, like, ready to do this. He's taken out a ton of guys to get here. He's covered in mud, and dude looks like a lion at this point to me. I think it's the way he squints his eyes and the blonde in his hair, which I think they dyed even more blonde than it naturally is. And he goes up and he's ready to take the hammer, and he is not worthy. He's not able to lift the hammer. And I don't know about you, Zach, but for me, I feel that this film has a lot of really great music, but this is the scene that I really notice it. They play this great music, and you just feel so terrible for him. He is completely broken.
And not only the music in this scene is great, but the cinematography in this scene, when he goes to pull up the hammer and you have the dirt flying, the thunder, the rain, just how he looks and he fails. I thought that was just an amazing scene, which they actually showed a lot in the trailers and the marketing up to this movie. And I recalled that because this scene is so iconic in the movie.
I agree. And Coulson actually lets him go in and try this. He says he wants to see what's going to happen because they don't really know what this object is. I mean, clearly it's a hammer, but they don't know what it's going to do. And when he fails, he says, all right, move in. And so S.H.I.E.L.D. ends up capturing Thor.
And this is also after the very Hawkeye comedic one-liner, which I thought fits him very well. And again, helps us introduce the viewers to that character. And so, yes, we see Thor, who is now behind bars or behind walls in captivity of S.H.I.E.L.D.
So Coulson comes in and interrogates Thor at this point, and he thinks Thor is an ex-KGB agent or maybe a mercenary because he just took out, in Coulson's words, some of the most highly trained men in the world. And he's not really sure how Thor did this. And he's talking to him, and Coulson leaves the room. And this is when we see Loki appear.
And this is what I believe really ties Thor down to earth when this is the moment that he decides to basically give up. As in, Loki tells him that Odin's dead, that Odin blames Thor, and Thor is just reeling from the fact that he is not worthy to pick up the hammer. So he brings all that information to heart, and he just looks defeated.
Yeah, Loki lies to him and says that his father is dead. And Thor thinks to himself, that is all his fault. That the strain that he put on him killed him. And as much as he's upset about not being worthy and about being stripped of his powers, he's upset that his rash actions caused his father to die. And I didn't pick this up on previous viewings, but I think this is what really causes the change of heart in Thor. It's not Jane Foster, and it's not the things that he experiences with her, although that probably helps, but it's this story that because he screwed up, his father is dead, and he can never return home.
And it's after this defeated Thor that we jump back to find out what Dr. Solveig and Jane Foster are up to. And it's at this point that the movie decides to take a shot at discussing both magic and science existing in the same universe.
So earlier in the movie, they noticed that some of the images they got from what is the Bifrost, which they don't know what it is, but the Bifrost dropping Thor off, they notice that there's an outline of a human in there. And so they're trying to reconcile how that can be possible and how the things that Thor is saying can be possible. Because up until this point, they don't believe that Thor is who he says he is. Dr. Selvig says that these are the stories that he grew up with as a child. They're Norse mythology. And so they're not really sure how to take Thor. At this point, they decide, you know what? Maybe what he's saying is real. They've got some other evidence. They're considering things more. And Darcy from nowhere throws out a line that, science is the same thing as magic. or the way she says it, magic is the same thing as science. It's just science that we don't understand yet. And this is an idea that they push for this film and for the next Thor film. And they eventually start to move away from, which I appreciate. But this is the way that they're trying to incorporate that magic side of Marvel into the more technological side of Marvel.
I agree. I think they mixed magic with superheroes, with science very well. And for me, this minor explanation works, and I think it also sets up the bigger explanation done by Thor a little later on in the movie.
So because they have come to terms with who they think Thor is, they end up sending Dr. Selvig out to the S.H.I.E.L.D. station to try to reclaim Thor, telling Coulson that he's a colleague and he was just upset that they had taken all of their stuff. How do you think that this scene played out? I mean, did it work for you?
So I actually thought this is one of maybe the low point in the movie. Now, granted, I didn't think Thor had a lot of low points just because it was a good movie. It was a solid movie. This scene didn't necessarily pay off, but it was okay. It worked. And so, as you mentioned, Dr. Solveig says what he says. They run a report and they find out that he is lying. They also add in a little bit of humor as it shows up that Thor is an MD, playing off the fact that his name is now Donald Blake.
For reasons unbeknownst to me, Coulson decides to give him Thor. I'm assuming that he wants to watch what he does.
And that's what I was going to ask you. Why do you think Coulson would allow Thor to leave? After watching this, it makes sense that Coulson wanted to wait to see what Thor would do to pick up the hammer, but it's pretty clear that this character cannot pick up the hammer, so that rules Thor as a character out from actually being the real Thor in Coulson's mind. So Coulson's still trying to figure out who this character is, so it doesn't necessarily make sense that he releases him to Dr. Solveig, because who knows, he could have been a Hydra agent.
The only thing that I can think of is he wants to follow him to find out where he came from, and maybe they can discover who he is. Because at this point in the universe, they're not worried about Hydra. Hydra was something that was eliminated back in World War II. And we'll talk more about Hydra next week with Captain America. But I don't think that that's the way he's thinking in this scene.
It's from here we jump back to Asgard, where we see Loki making a pact with the Frost Giants to allow them to enter into Asgard and kill Odin. We mentioned the scene a little prior in the podcast, and it just reveals Loki's story arc and more of his villainry. After that, we jump back to Earth after Dr. Solveig and Thor have gone to a bar. Solveig drinks a little too much, and they go back to where Jane Foster is.
So this scene gets us Thor back in touch with Jane. And they have this exchange on the top of her little lab area. And this is where we basically get confirmation of Darcy's theory from Thor, where he says, yes, magic, but magic is science. And he explains to her the 9 realms and how they're connected by the tree Yggdrasil, which is this, I'm not sure if it's clear in this movie. It seems to be some kind of spiritual idea of how the universe is connected. And I've always had a question about the 9 realms, Zach. In the way that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has portrayed them, each one seems to be a planet. And yet they call them the 9 realms, which makes it sound like there are only 9. But if they're planets, why aren't there, 100,000 realms, since there's X number of planets?
That's a great question, Caleb. In Norse mythology, as you mentioned, you have the tree, and then you have these 9 realms all diced throughout it, with Asgard kind of holding them all into place and protecting kind of the other realms. However, in the cinematic universe, I like what you mentioned, that it's more of a spiritual idea, but that doesn't necessarily flow into why there aren't more than 9 realms. possibly Odin just wanted to take over 9 different planets, the most powerful planets in that known area. But you're right, it doesn't necessarily make sense when you bring up the galaxy and the vast expanse of the alien races and other sentient forms everywhere.
And I'm pretty sure that you see Yggdrasil at one point in Thor 2, and it's not a massive tree flowing through the universe. Am I wrong about that?
Let's just ignore it. It doesn't matter. No, but Caleb, you're not wrong. And I think this is just part of the Norse mythology they try to brush over, as later it doesn't necessarily make sense.
Following on, we cut back to Asgard again, and we see the Warriors 3. They have decided to go help Thor. And so they go out to the Bifrost, and Heimdall is there, which I'm not sure we've mentioned. He's the person that controls the Bifrost. He lets people in and out, and he's the only one that can activate it since he has the key.
Heimdall in this movie is played by Idris Elba. Did I say that correctly?
Yes.
And I think he does a fairly good job acting as Heimdall. Heimdall, as we've seen him in several different scenes we just haven't mentioned, is able to foresee, and see everything that is going on in this movie. Caleb, you mentioned this a little ways back in our podcast, that possibly Odin has some type of sixth sense, and how he was able to see the frost giants going into his vault at the beginning of the movie. Odin, in Norse mythology, actually has Heimdall's power. Odin is able to see everything that is going on in the world and the 9 realms all through his one eye. So I thought it was kind of interesting that they did away with Odin's power. However, Heimdall is still a true Norse god in that mythology, as well as he is in Thor comic books.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that before, and that would make a lot of sense as to why he could see those things. Maybe he still has some sort of that power, and they just don't elaborate on it. But jumping back to the actual scene, we've got Heimdall, who lets basically the Warriors 3 and Sif pass. Loki has visited him earlier in the film and has told him not to let anybody through the Bifrost. And so he actually calls the Warriors 3 down to him and asks them if basically they would commit treason to get Thor back. And Sif, being the brash kind of person that knows what she wants, says, yes, absolutely. And Heimdall, in a very funny moment, says, good, because at this point, we've only seen him as this sort of stoic, speaking very little character. And he walks off and says, I cannot open the Bifrost to you, but he leaves that key behind that I mentioned, which is actually his sword. And I love the performance here by Idris Elba. This is an actor who I have grown to love over the past few years. When he was cast in this movie, he was not a very big name, but he has come to be a big name since. And you see that in the progression of the Thor movies, as we'll talk about in those podcasts, but he gets bigger and bigger roles with each film.
Adding on to that funny moment, he just starts running across the bridge, just jogging away as the Warriors 3 and Sif decide to depart back to Earth. So they go to Earth, and it's here that we see a hungover Dr. Solvig and this kind of homely Thor, as I like to put him. He has on his plaid, he's got his jeans. I mean, he's like a country singer, but a god as well.
This is a scene that a lot of people had an issue with when they watched Thor, because he does a 180 in this scene, right? Earlier in the film, he was incredibly arrogant. Even later, he was very sure of himself. We see in one scene, a classic scene that most people remember, when he wants more coffee, he throws the cup on the ground and says, another. And here, he's serving people breakfast. It's an interesting development, but a lot of people feel that it's not earned.
It's true love, man. True love through Natalie Portman's gaze.
And this is what I was kind of mentioning earlier, where I felt that he was broken in that scene with Coulson and Loki. And I feel that when you view it through that lens, this scene works a lot better. if you don't realize that that's the scene that causes him to flip, then I totally agree. This does come out of left field and is a little strange. I think that his transition could have been handled a bit better with a couple more scenes, but I understand that they were probably wanting to keep the running time short, especially for this character, because they weren't sure if the audiences were going to like this character. And when you have shorter times for your movie, you can show it more in a day, which means you can make more money.
And in the end, it does work, because later on, here you see the Warriors 3 and Sif walking through the town as people are staring, pointing, making comments about Robin Hood and Jackie Chan and everything else. And they find Thor, they talk to Thor, they reveal to him that everything Loki has said is a lie, and that's then when Thor himself makes this turn. Thor is ready then to help them get back to Asgard to, well, take over as king again, as his brother has kind of unrightfully on the throne.
And it's at this time that we see Loki has sent the Destroyer to Earth to kill Thor.
Cue fight scene. So what did you think about this end scene? It's here that we see the Warriors 3 basically saying, don't worry, we've got this, we'll handle this. You got the Destroyer, and then all concluding with a sacrifice and a redemption by Thor.
I think that visually this works phenomenally. We saw the Destroyer earlier in the film, and we get to see more of him here. And the things that he does visually, I think is really cool. I mean, he's made up of those different plates, which allow him to sort of reconfigure himself around objects. We see that when Sif tries to stab him through the neck, and he's not able to. And we also see that the Warriors 3 are not a match for him.
And the Destroyer does turn out to be just a great enemy. Again, CGI, he looks amazing. His aesthetics look fantastic. He puts up a good fight. The Warriors 3. I mean, it's an engaging fight scene. But not only do we get that fight scene, we also get the sacrifice that Thor is ready to make. After learning that Loki had sent the Destroyer, he simply walks up to it, ready to sacrifice himself to save this town and for Loki to end it all.
Yeah, he gives a little speech, and it looks like the Destroyer is going to walk away and leave him there. And he does this like half turn and then comes back and just backhand Thor, which is incredibly painful because he's got these spikes on his arm. And you see that when Thor's laying there on the ground, and he's got all these cuts and stuff. And I think that if it wasn't for Thor's hammer, if it wasn't Thor that was doing it, that person would be completely dead.
And as the movie had already portrayed in the hospital scene, we know that Thor doesn't have his powers, thus it hurts a lot. However, he still retains some type of strength, which is why I don't think he's dead.
And this is also something I noticed this time. We see intercut with him getting hit. It cuts back to Odin, and I'm not sure if his eye opens or if it twitches, but it shows Odin. And I actually think, I'm just realizing, maybe he does have that all-powerful sight because he knows what's going on here. And I think he's actually the one that sends Mjolnir back to Thor, because there's nothing in the enchantment that says it should go back to Thor. And since it is intercut like that, I think that maybe he's the one that sends it back to Thor so Thor can regain his powers because he's learned his lesson.
And that's a good idea, Caleb. I actually never thought about that, but it makes sense. I mean, we do see Odin, and when it zooms up to his face, you actually can notice a tear. A tear's kind of falling down his eye, right, for his son. And then that is when Thor has that redemption arc. He has now earned himself a worthy spot to hold the hammer, right? Because he is no longer selfish. He now sacrificed himself for others. And because of that, he has found himself worthy to grab the hammer. Cue hammer flying in. And I thought an epic moment, reaches his hand up and grabs the hammer, and boom, he becomes Thor, as we see this kind of anime moment where the chainmail goes back onto his body and he resumes his stature he had at the beginning of the movie.
And you called it an anime moment. I think it looks cool, where the armor comes out of, it looks like it's formed out of the actual lightning onto his body. And so once he's got his armor back and his power back, he basically flies up into the air and he creates, I guess, a tornado, which lifts the destroyer into the air.
Well, I was going to say, Caleb, this is interesting because this is the only time in the movie we see him using any of his God of Thunder powers that he has.
That's true. And I was going to mention, this is a little bit of a disappointment for me. The fight scene up until this point has been really good. And I'm surprised that all it took to destroy the destroyer was a really big fall and maybe a good hit to the head. I mean, and even the stuff that he does, we don't get a clear shot of it. We pretty much see Thor from like chest up for most of these shots where he lifts him into the air and he deflects the destroyer's beams. And I wish that it would have just been a little bit more extended and maybe we get to see more of his thunder and lightning powers.
I don't remember a lot from this Thor movie, but I do recall that the end fight scene was somewhat disappointing. I think on one hand it works because it shows us that Thor is the ultimate powerhouse. On the other hand, it is very short. But then again, we thought the Incredible Hulk had a too drawn out fight scene. We thought that Iron Man 2 had a too short fight scene. So either way, I don't know if Marvel could win.
That's true, but we actually find out this isn't the last fight scene. Thor goes back to Asgard to confront Loki, and they have a fight scene there.
That's correct. So after this scene, he says his goodbye to Jane Foster, saying that he'll see her again. Spoiler alert, he will, but not in this movie. And he also makes a quick pact with Coulson, ?
Yeah, he tells Coulson that they're fighting on the same side. And I'm not sure, maybe Coulson knows this at this point, but really all this is to try to form a link that they can use so that when the Avengers come together, it's not out of left field that this god is on the team. Which really doesn't end up paying off in the Avengers, but it's a nice nod.
You're right, Caleb. So we have one final scene, and we have a couple more final scenes, but one final fight scene where Thor goes back up to Asgard and fights Loki. And it's here that Loki uses his powers to create other forms, which is very comic-esque as he does this in the comics.
So during this fight scene, we see that Loki has unleashed the Bifrost onto Jotunheim, which is the home of the Frost Giants. And earlier in the movie, they drop a line that says, if you leave it open too long, it basically builds and builds and builds and destroys things. I'm not really sure technically how that works, how something that basically transports you can destroy something, but in any case, it does. And so Thor is basically fighting Loki to prevent this from happening. He's trying to stop the destruction. And he says several times he doesn't want to fight Loki. This is a very emotional thing for him to do. But Loki is just not giving up. He won't give him any ground.
And I thought this was a pretty cool scene how Thor decides to go ahead and break the Bifrost, break the Rainbow Bridge so that Loki's plan doesn't come to fruition.
It's a very noble thing to do. It follows his arc that he's been having through this whole movie where he's becoming more and more selfless. And he told Jane that he would come back for her. And he knows that if he destroys that bridge, he will not be able to come back. And it also is going to cause a lot of problems for stranding people there, but he doesn't see another way to do it. And I think that this is very heroic.
This also, for me, tends to be one of the most confusing scenes. The reason behind that is that Thor is pounding his hammer against the bridge. The scenes are cutting to other different scenes. So he pounds it, it goes to Loki, he pounds it. It goes to Odin, and we see Odin's eye open. Okay, so he is now done with his Odin sleep. But just a few hits later, the bridge breaks, everything falls, and then Odin is right there to catch both Thor and Loki. So is he really Odin or is he Barry Allen?
You know, there's a couple things with this. We don't see Odin do a lot in this movie, and really any of the movies. We don't know the extent of his powers. So maybe he's got a power that allows him to teleport. Maybe he's got some kind of machine that allows him to teleport. Or maybe it's that movie-making timeline where they show you something in sequence to be dramatic, but that's not actually when it happened, right? Maybe his eye opened when Thor returned, and he's able to get over there. I think it's a good point that you bring up, but I don't think it's plot-breaking.
No, and it's not. And it's here that we just mentioned Thor's story arc kind of comes to end. It was a great arc. And it's here that Loki's true motives were revealed and it comes to end, right? Because as he's hanging on, he states all he wanted was his father to see him as a rightful king. Not that he necessarily wanted to be king, but that he just wanted his father's approval, in which Odin shuts that down.
Yeah, he basically tells him that he wasn't good enough. And we talked about it a little earlier in the podcast at a sequence, but just to remind you, he let the frost giants in to try to kill Odin, but he basically comes in and kills them. His plan all along was to kill them in front of his father so that he can appear to be a great ruler. And as you said, Odin doesn't take it at all, and Loki does not take that well. He basically just gives up and he lets go to fall down into a black hole, which I'm not sure if the Bifrost created that black hole because it's right there next to it, but I think it might have.
And it's here that I think Loki's death was simply unjustified because he supposedly falls into that black hole. We don't know what happened to him. You presume he's probably dead, but then again, it's a comic book movie. Nobody's dead. And after that, we get the wrap up to the movie that obviously Thor is wishing that Jane Foster was with him, right? After the Warriors 3 Sif and all the Asgardians are partying away in Asgard. And then we go back down to Earth where we see that the earthly Warriors 3 are building their own compound, and you find out that Jane Foster is searching for Thor. But it's after all of that we get the end credits scene. And this is why I say Loki's death wasn't necessarily justified, because 5 minutes prior, you just saw Loki disappear. He gave up himself. He might die. However, in this end credit scene, he reappears again.
That's a good point. But considering that these end credit scenes are conceived separately from the film, I understand why it happened. I also know that the reason they did that, where he falls into the black hole, is to give him an out so that he can reappear in the Avengers. Because they knew when they were making Thor that Loki was going to end up being the main villain for the Avengers. So they had to separate him from Asgard and get him away so that he could come down in the Avengers and attack Earth.
And so in this end credit scene that we have, we see Dr. Solveig talking to Nick Fury. And Nick Fury wants him to start working on a secret project with, as he opens the box, the Tesseract. Now my one question for you, Caleb, is this. How on earth did this one-eyed man get the Tesseract?
So for those of you that don't know, the Tesseract plays a big plot point in Captain America, which at this point had not come out. So for the general audience, they didn't know what this thing is. In the comics, it's called the Cosmic Cube, but they thought that was a little bit too comic booky, so they changed the name to the Tesseract. And essentially, it's an unlimited source of power. And as you said, he wants Selvig to look into it. I think that he has it because, as we see in the Avengers, as we see in Captain America, Tony Stark's father, Howard, actually retrieves it. And because Howard was a founding member of S.H.I.E.L.D., as we learned in Iron Man 2, Nick Fury probably got it from him.
Well, that makes a lot more sense.
Now, the thing in this part of the movie that I have always found a bit confusing is at the very tail end of this, after they explain what's going on, Loki appears in a reflection. And after Nick Fury says, it's power, Loki says, well, that's worth a look. And Eric Selvig looks up and says, well, that's worth a look. And so they say the same line, which implies Loki is controlling Eric Selvig. But we also see in the Avengers that that's not the case. So I don't know if this is just one of those things that they thought would be a good idea at the time, and going forward it really wasn't, or what? What's your read on that?
I'm sure, as you said, it was something they thought going forward and they simply retconned it. However, I think it still works. To me, it implied not necessarily that Loki can control Dr. Solvig, but that he simply can point him in a direction he wants him to go, right? And so Loki here is uttering words that he wants Dr. Solvig to accept this project. So Dr. Solvig does. And it feeds, I believe, right into the Avengers. If you believe that, then you can believe that at the opening scenes of the Avengers, the reason he wanted Dr. Solvig to work on this project is that he could work on it in such a way that it would be ready for Loki to come and take the Tesseract away from him.
That's true, but I think the scene would have worked better if Loki said, "That's worth a look," and Eric said something else completely, because we never see any other time that he can point someone's consciousness in a certain direction without touching them. And he can only do that in the Avengers because he has a new fancy stick.
Well, as I said earlier, Caleb, you will not win round 3.
I'll give it to you. You can have it.
And so that wraps up the movie Thor. And Caleb, when we look at this movie in hindsight, how did it do both ratings-wise and commercially?
So this movie had a budget of $150 million, and it had a worldwide gross of $449 million. Now, that's not the margins that Iron Man was getting, but that's definitely better than The Incredible Hulk. And it still turned a profit. So this was a successful movie for Marvel. Critically, I think this movie is a little bit all over the place. I think when it came out originally, people liked it for the most part. I think some people had some issues with it. But I feel that as time has gone on and we've gotten better and better movies, especially after Thor 2, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, people's opinion of this film and the Thor series of films has kind of soured a bit. Currently on Rotten Tomatoes, it's sitting at a 77%, and Metacritic has it sitting at a 57%. So those aren't great numbers. I know people who absolutely adore this movie, but I also know people who, they don't really like the Thor movies.
I thought overall it was a pretty good movie. And what's interesting is that at the end of this movie, we also see, I believe for the first time, in the credits it says blank will return in the Avengers, the blank being Thor, but that line being used now consecutively in the other Marvel movies.
Yeah, if you don't know, that line is used in pretty much every Marvel movie now. And it's something that kind of clues us in, because for a long time we didn't know if certain characters were going to show up in the Avengers or not. And it's a clear statement that, you know what, this isn't the end for the character. He is going to return.
Verily.
And that's another point that I wanted to bring up. Unintended, you segued into what I wanted to talk about. For this movie, they updated Thor, and specifically what I want to talk about is the dialogue. In the comics, Thor has a very Shakespearean dialogue. There's a lot of these and thous, as I'm sure you know, Zach. And they changed that for this movie. They updated it. It's not everyday speech, but it's that sort of 1900s, 1800s kind of British royalty type of speech, which I think they kind of had to do, because the general audience is not going to relate to "thou shalt do thine bidding" or whatever. But it is a shame that we kind of lost part of that poeticness, because that's something that is really interesting about Thor, especially in the comic books, is his speech is so poetic. It's like a poem.
Yeah, it works really well in the comics just to set his character apart. But this just would not have worked in the movies. I think it would have been cringeworthy if they had tried it. And thankfully they did depart from it. So yeah, it was saddening that they had to depart from it, but just the way the MCU movie is going, and we talked about this, I believe, in one of our earlier podcasts, is that they modernize everything. And this was just one of those modernizations of Thor, that instead of speaking this older dialect, he would speak, well, how we would now. He does still have some of those dialect scripts that he will say here or there, and I feel like we hear more often in the Avengers, but it works for this movie. And so, Caleb, as we go to wrap up, how do you see that Thor sets up for the Avengers?
So, as we mentioned towards the end of the movie portion, Loki ends up being the main villain of the Avengers, right? So, out of all of the movies that come before Avengers, this probably has the closest tie to the Avengers. The other one being Captain America, for reasons we'll get into next week. But it very clearly sets up his character, and it doesn't just introduce us to him, but it actually gives us an origin story for the villain. And that's something that's interesting about this movie, is it's not just an origin story for the hero. It sets up the villain for the future of all of these movies. It also expands the universe, where in the MCU, the Asgardians are not really seen as gods. They talk about them as gods in this movie, but by and large, and especially in interviews and things we'll see later, they're treated more as an alien race, which is something that plays in a lot more in the Avengers, and it allows some of that more wackiness to come in, more comic book things, because as comic booky as Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk were, they're fairly grounded in the grand scheme of things. And so I think that it opened up the world to those sillier aspects, and I think that it did so successfully. I think it also gave them a sort of template that they can use when introducing other more outlandish characters into the cinematic universe.
Yeah, it really expanded the MCU for the better, that we'll find out more so in the Avengers movie.
One thing I did want to talk about is on this DVD or Blu-ray is they have the very first Marvel one-shot that they did for several films titled The Consultant. Now, we talked about in The Incredible Hulk that because of the success of Iron Man, they added that scene on to the end of it where Tony comes in and speaks to General Ross. We talked about how that doesn't really work in the overall story of the MCU. And this is a little tidbit they made for the fans that corrects that problem.
That's a good point, Caleb, and it continues this trend of Marvel releasing these one-shots with their DVDs to retcon different, aspects of the movies that didn't necessarily work moving forward in the MCU universe.
Right. So, as we learn in this, they basically send in Tony Stark to sabotage the fact that the World Security Council wants the Abomination on the Avengers team. But I think something that's arguably more important is the fact that this is a scene between Agent Coulson and Agent Jasper Sitwell, who we really need to fall more in love with Sitwell for some developments that are going to happen later on in the cinematic universe.
So to wrap up, Caleb, where does Thor line up in your breakdown of Marvel movies?
So this is a film that now that Marvel is 18, 19 movies in, I sort of forget about, right? I think that all of those Phase 1 movies are kind of like that because compared to the movies we have now, they're a little bit more mundane. They're a little bit neutered because they hadn't broken through to the general audiences yet. But that does not at all mean this is a bad movie. This is a very, very well-made movie. I think at this point, it's probably the best love story that Marvel had done. Even though it's not amazing, I think it beats the one that was in The Incredible Hulk. I think it beats the sort of back and forth romance that was in Iron Man 2. And maybe not the romance in Iron Man 1, but that really wasn't a love story so much as two characters coming to like each other. I think that it flows very well. As we've talked about, I think that it introduces all these new concepts to the Marvel Cinematic Universe very well. The casting is amazing. Anthony Hopkins as Odin, I think, is a weak point. Just because he doesn't emote a lot in these films, and I don't know if it's because of the eye patch. Maybe it'll fall off if he moves his eyebrows. But Chris Hemsworth, and especially Tom Hiddleston, is a breakout star in this film. And he only goes on to elevate that in later movies. And so I think this is a really solid movie. And one thing that we didn't talk about is the fact that this is sort of a reverse version of a superhero movie. In most superhero movies, you have a normal person and they get powers and they learn to use them. And then they're super. In this movie, we have a super person who loses his powers and has to unlearn who he is instead of learning who he is. He has to unlearn that arrogance to regain his powers. And it's, I think, an interesting take on a formula that they had been doing for several years at this point. And I think it works really well. So going back to last week, my ranking was Iron Man. I believe The Incredible Hulk was number 2. And Iron Man 2 was number 3. This movie, I am going to place at number 2 because I think it is just so good. It's not as memorable as Iron Man. It's not as quippy as Iron Man. And I think Iron Man is just a bit more fun. So that's why it's going at my number 2, which brings my list to number 1, Iron Man, number 2, Thor, number 3, The Incredible Hulk, and number 4, Iron Man 2. How about you?
Yeah, so when I look at Thor and compared to the other movies that we've had so far, I'm in agreement with you to the fact of how Thor just plays out in and of itself. It's a fun movie. It develops the MCU. It's a really interesting take on a superhero as a Nordic god, and this movie does a really good job introducing him, introducing Loki as a Marvel villain, and bringing that all together. The love story works better, as you mentioned, but for all those highlights, there's also a lot of negatives. Now, I wouldn't say the negatives are as big as, say, Iron Man 2 or The Incredible Hulk, but it still slows down the movie. We have the fight scenes that just don't necessarily pay off in some parts. We have some plot holes that just seem inconsistent. And overall, while this is a fun movie, I love what you said, Caleb. It's just not super memorable. And so when I look at Iron Man 2, and The Incredible Hulk, this does better than some of them, but it doesn't do as good as Iron Man. So last week, my ranking was Iron Man number 1 was my number 1, Iron Man 2 was my number 2, and The Incredible Hulk was my number 3, with the caveat that Hulk and Iron Man 2 could switch at any moment. I would place Thor exactly in the same spot you did, Caleb, on my number 2 slot. I think it is way better than Iron Man 2, and I think it's just better overall than The Incredible Hulk. It has a really consistent storyline. It has great acting by Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston, just phenomenal acting job by both those actors. And overall, it just does a great job. However, it doesn't have the quips, like you mentioned, of Iron Man. Iron Man 1 just has this magic about that I could go back right now and I could watch it. I would laugh. I would have a good time. I would enjoy myself. If I had to go back and watch Thor this instant, I don't know if I would enjoy myself just as much. I would still enjoy the movie, but I could see myself getting somewhat bored. And so that is why I place Thor as my number 2 movie in the MCU as of right now.
And going forward, we talked about with all these movies what they do for comics and other movies that came after them. And to my knowledge, even though this was a fairly the movie that did really well, the comics didn't really embrace that many aspects of the movies.
Yeah, I would agree. The comics didn't really touch on this movie. They didn't necessarily modernize Thor. They wanted to keep Thor the way he was. Now, they modernized his look, but as we had talked about, that had already been done, and this movie just took its cue from the comics. So as far as the way he talks to the storylines, they pretty much kept it the same way they did in the comics instead of following the movie version.
I think that there are a few maybe minor characters that they introduce into the comics. I know that eventually they did introduce Coulson to the comics, but you can't attribute that to this film alone. And so it did have some impact. I think most of the impact of this film was, as we mentioned before, its impact that it expanded the Marvel Universe, and also that it gave all these actors a major launching point for their careers.
Exactly. And so, Caleb, a fun way to end our time together talking about Thor, I went back, read some articles, and have 5 comments from those articles, and I'm going to call them the 10-year predictions, all right? So here's what's going to happen. I am going to read you those comments, and I believe a lot of them come from one article I found, which you had already mentioned, announcing that Thor cut its budget from 300 down to 150 million. You have to vote. Are these comments idiotic, or are they thoughtful? Are you ready to go?
Yeah, let's do it.
The first one is from Foom. I would suggest treating Thor like a true superhero who happens to bang a stick on the ground to change instead of putting on the long johns. Idiotic or thoughtful?
If I have to categorize that, I definitely think that's idiotic.
You want to see a movie of him banging sticks on the ground?
You know, I don't want to see any sticks banging on the ground. I don't think that would be that fun.
The next comment comes from a true Thor fan, Thorista. She says, they screw up Thor, and Marvel will never see a dime from me ever again. I wonder what little shrimp they'll think of using for Thor. Is Chris Hemsworth...
Oh, that's a hard one.
It is. Is Chris Hemsworth a shrimp? Is that idiotic or thoughtful?
Can I go for idiotic?
You can. Right in the middle. I like it.
Yeah, because as we mentioned, Chris Hemsworth, he was a shrimp when they hired him, but he beefed up. So I don't know.
This third one comes from Scott, who states, there's no point in a Thor movie unless it is an extremely grand scale. In fact, the safest route would be to do it all in CGI, like Beowulf.
Oh, well, as we know, that Beowulf movie did not do very well, and one of the main concerns was the CGI, so I don't think I can agree with him. Oh, but he's right, it needs to be grand, but it was grand, but probably not as grand as he was thinking. Ooh, I'm going to have to go with idiotic on this one, although I do think he makes some good points.
Our fourth one, and what I think is actually the best comment of them all, states, from Bugs Bunny, I presume, but it's just Bugs. How the F are they going to fit Thor into this? Question mark, question mark, question mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. I'm not a huge on the whole comic book series, but Thor is far from completely hugely different universe. And from what I've seen in the recent movies that Marvel and other studios have screwed up, they pretty much would have to poof Thor into it, suggesting they don't have inner film technology to bring him through a SHIELD quotation marks or Avengers sequence. And why the HE double hockey sticks are they dressed like gay strippers in nowadays movies? Question mark, question mark. Marvel has some serious makeup work to do. Please add some storyline, folks. We need a good line of entertainment, not a bunch of attempted remakes of amazing comics. And whoever it was who said Brad Pitt is an okay Thor, okay, that's a good idea. But for Captain America, I have no effing clue that one's going to be real tricky. Good luck, producer/movie director people, are going to need it to help save A from being run over by some 50-year-old kid who loves their comics.
Wow.
Idiotic or thoughtful?
See, that one started off, I knew exactly, and then it just kind of...
It escalated, man. It snowballed. Can you go very idiotic?
Ooh, well, okay, well, look, here's the thing with that one. While I don't agree with his temperament, I think he actually brings up some really, really good points. So I'm going to go with thoughtful, because they definitely needed to update some of those costumes. They did with Thor, as we talked about, but the Warriors 3 in those comic books, man, they they would have been tough to do if they were trying to translate them exactly. So I'm going to put that in the thoughtful category.
Folks, if any of you ever want to know what Caleb's temperament is, you now have figured it out. Please continue to subscribe to us and listen to us, because at least one of the podcasters has a good head on his shoulders. And Caleb, to round this off, I thought this was the best, the cherry on top comment. And in fact, this is not idiotic at all. I would give Roberto $100 million. In fact, I think Marvel should invite Roberto to the opening of Marvel's Avengers Infinity War, because 10 years ago, on a random article, Roberto wrote this: everything that Marvel does should lead up to two projects, ... A huge Kick-A Infinity Gauntlet trilogy, ... and a Civil War trilogy. That would make me the happiest person in the world. Period.
I would love to catch up with him and figure out what he thinks of what they've done. We don't have a Civil War trilogy, but we got the movie, and we're not getting an Infinity War trilogy, but we are getting 2 movies. So I think that man deserves that $100,000.
He has to be the happiest person in the world. Talking about being the happiest person in the world, if you like music and need some editing done for you, and you want to be the happiest person in the world, then go ahead and go over to TaylorPooleMusic.com.
That's right. That's TaylorPoole music.com. Make sure you check him out. He did our intro, and he is a phenomenal guy.
Thanks for listening to 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Thor. We would love to hear your comments, feedback, or suggestions for our podcast at cuzwerenerds@gmail.com. That's CUZWERENERDS@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or any other major social networks or podcasting sites. Tune in next week as we discuss the first Avenger, Captain America. How did the other Chris transform from a superhero hothead into a beloved Cap? Does this first non-modern setting of an MCU movie achieve success? And how does this movie directly impact the Avengers? Find these answers out and more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War. Stay nerdy.
Da